For more than a decade, Steve Harvey had walked onto that stage with confidence. The lights were always the same, warm, bright, almost blinding. The laughter was familiar. The music hit its cue. Families clapped, teased each other, hugged. It was controlled chaos, the kind that made America feel a little lighter at the end of a long day. After over 30 years in television, Steve thought he had seen everything. Funny answers, awkward answers, families who didn't speak to each other off stage but smiled for the camera, tears of joy, occasional arguments, even the rare meltdown when someone lost $20,000 by one wrong word. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for what happened that Tuesday afternoon in March 2024. It started like any other taping of Family Feud in Atlanta. Two families, bright smiles, competitive energy. On one side stood the Martinez family from Phoenix, Arizona. Carlos Martinez, 52 years old, a Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, stood tall at the center. Shoulders squared, but eyes soft. His wife Rosa, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, with slightly lighter brown skin, dark, shoulder-length, loose, wavy hair, and warm brown eyes, stood beside him, calm and warm. Their daughter Maria, a 24-year-old Latina woman with light brown skin, slim build, long black hair in a low ponytail, large expressive eyes, and subtle makeup, studying law, vibrated with excitement. Their son Diego, a 23-year-old Latino man with medium brown skin, tall and slim, short black fade hair, long face, and brown eyes, freshly graduated with an engineering degree, tried to look composed. And then there was Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, short and slightly stooped, with silver white hair in a neat low bun and deep brown eyes, 78 years old, wearing a beautifully embroidered blouse stitched decades ago in Mexico. On the other side stood the Anderson family from rural Pennsylvania. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built with broad shoulders, dark brown crew-cut hair, square jaw, and light blue eyes, firm handshake, tight smile. His wife Jennifer, a white woman in her mid-40s, with a slightly slim build, dark blonde shoulder-length straight hair, pale blue eyes, and an anxious expression. Their two adult children, Ashley, a 25-year-old white woman, tall and slender, long light brown hair with a center part and large eyes, and another adult child. And Brad's brother Mike, a white man in his early 40s, shorter than Brad with a stocky build, short dark brown hair, and light brown eyes. From the outside, it was just another American game show matchup, but sometimes history doesn't announce itself with a warning. Sometimes it whispers first. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Now let me take you back to that stage. The early rounds were lighthearted. The Martinez family worked like a team that had spent decades solving problems together. When Abuela Elena gave an answer in Spanish that landed at number 1 on the board, the audience erupted. St., a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache with a sharp yet warm gaze, leaned toward her, grinning wide. "That's what I'm talking about, Abuela." The crowd loved her. You could feel it. That kind of warmth can't be rehearsed, but as the points stacked up in favor of the Martinez family, something shifted on the other side of the stage. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, jaw tightened. At first, it was subtle, a little longer stare at the scoreboard, a harder clap than necessary, a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Ste noticed. After years of reading people for a living, he had developed an instinct. Something in Brad's posture felt off. Not competitive, not playful, something heavier. By the 5th round, the Martinez family needed just one strong answer to secure the game and advance to fast money for $20,000. Ste called Carlos and Brad to the podium. The question appeared on the board. Name something people do to celebrate their heritage. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, hit the buzzer first. Cook traditional food, confident, proud, simple. Good answer! Good answer! The crowd shouted. The board flipped. Number 1. Cheers exploded from the Martinez side. Carlos turned back toward his family, smiling, not arrogantly, just gratefully. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes, walked back to his podium. And that's when it happened. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant for the room. It was muttered. One word, a racial slur. Ugly, sharp, heavy. The kind of word that carries generations of prejudice inside it. The microphone clipped to Brad's shirt picked it up with cruel clarity. In the control room, an audio engineer froze. Did you hear that? The director's face drained of color. Cut! 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 The lights were still on. The audience clapped awkwardly, confused. Some people near the front had heard it. A few gasped. On stage, time felt distorted. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, felt the heat rush to his face. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, moved instinctively closer to her mother. Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother, didn't fully understand what was said, but she understood tone. She had lived long enough to recognize hatred, even in a language that wasn't hers. STA, a male host in his early 60s, didn't move at first. His smile disappeared, his jaw set. The warmth drained from his expression, replaced by something steady, focused. He walked toward the producer without saying a word. In the control room, they replayed the audio. There was no ambiguity, no mishearing, no confusion. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, had said it, and now STE had a decision to make. In television, there is always an easier option. Edit it out, resume taping, pretend it never happened. Protect the brand, protect the sponsors, protect the ratings. But as STE, a male host in his early 60s, stood there listening through those headphones, something else ran through his mind. He thought about his own grandmother. He thought about what it feels like to be disrespected in public. He thought about that elderly woman standing under stage lights, proud to be on American television with her family. And in that quiet, controlled chaos behind the scenes of a game show, STE understood something very clearly. This wasn't just about a word, it was about what happens when everyone hears it and stays silent. Before that word ever echoed through a studio microphone, before headlines and hashtags and debates, there was simply a family. The Martinez family did not arrive in America with a plan to become a symbol. They arrived with 2 suitcases, a few phone numbers scribbled on paper, and a belief, fragile but persistent, that hard work meant something in this country. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, still remembered his first night in Phoenix in 1999. The air felt different, dry, heavy with dust. He had $300 in his pocket and a job washing dishes at a restaurant that didn't even pronounce his name correctly. Carlos, his manager would say. Carlos never corrected him. He worked the late shift, burned his hands on industrial sinks, learned English from coworkers and late-night television. For years, his world smelled like soap, grease, and exhaustion. There were nights he sat alone in his car after work and wondered if he had made a mistake bringing Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, with slightly lighter brown skin, into this uncertainty. But Rosa never let him stay in doubt for long. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, with slightly lighter brown skin, medium build, dark, shoulder-length, loose, wavy hair, and warm brown eyes, worked as a home health aide while studying for her nursing certification. She listened to English language tapes on a small radio while cooking dinner. She practiced medical terminology until midnight, whispering complex words so she wouldn't wake the children. When Maria Martinez, a 24-year-old Latina woman with light brown skin, much younger as an 8-year-old girl with long black hair, was 8 years old, She came home from school in tears because another child told her to go back where you came from. Maria had been born in Arizona. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, wanted to march into that school the next morning. Rosa stopped him. "We will teach her who she is," she said, "not let them define her." And so they did. They taught their children Spanish at home and English in the world. They taught them to stand tall without shouting, to work harder than necessary, to be undeniable. Diego Martinez, a 23-year-old Latino man, much younger as a college student, once confessed during his sophomore year of college that he considered changing his last name on job applications. Martinez felt heavy, obvious. He had read studies about resume bias. He knew what doors sometimes stayed closed. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, sat across from his son at the kitchen table and said quietly, "If they don't hire Martinez, then they don't deserve Martinez." Diego kept his name. He graduated near the top of his engineering class. Success did not arrive all at once. Carlos saved for nearly 10 years before opening his first small restaurant, 12 tables, 1 cook, 1 waitress. He worked 14-hour days again, but this time the name on the door read Martinez Grill. 2 more locations followed over the next decade. Not flashy, not empire building, just steady growth, a reputation for good food and better service. By 2024, the Martinez family was comfortable, not wealthy, but secure, and that security meant something profound to Abuela Elena. Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver white hair in a neat low bun, had lived through poverty in rural Mexico. She had seen neighbors disappear during political unrest. She had crossed a border not because she wanted adventure, but because she wanted her grandchildren to have safety. Her English remained limited, but her pride was fluent. When the call came that they had been selected for Family Feud, she cried. Not because of the money, because it meant she would stand under American lights and say, "We are here." On the morning of the taping in Atlanta, she carefully packed the embroidered blouse her mother had sewn decades earlier. The thread was slightly faded, but the colors still held life. Deep reds, bright blues, golden flowers stitched by hands that had never imagined television cameras. Maria Martinez, a 24-year-old Latina woman with light brown skin, slim build, long black hair in a low ponytail, large expressive eyes, and subtle makeup, helped her fasten it. "You look beautiful, Abuela." Elena smiled and replied in Spanish. "Today we show them who we are." Backstage at the studio, the Martinez family prayed quietly in a small circle. Nothing dramatic, just gratitude, just calm. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short, black, classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, squeezed Rosa Martinez's hand, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, with slightly lighter brown skin, dark shoulder-length, loose, wavy hair, and warm brown eyes, and whispered, "No matter what happens, I'm proud of us." For them, Family Feud wasn't just a game. It was proof. Proof that a dishwasher could become an owner. Proof that an immigrant nurse could raise a future lawyer. Proof that heritage and success could exist in the same sentence. When the first rounds began, their teamwork was effortless. They didn't argue. They didn't showboat. When one of them missed an answer, another stepped in with encouragement. And when Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver white hair in a neat low bun, answered in Spanish during one round, hesitant but smiling, the audience erupted when the board revealed she was right. The applause felt bigger than just a game show cheer. It felt like validation. From across the stage, Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, watched. He saw a family celebrating their heritage openly. He saw an audience cheering. What he did not see, what he could not see, were the decades of sacrifice behind that moment. The burned hands, the whispered English lessons, the nights of doubt, the tears after schoolyard insults. He saw the scoreboard. He saw himself losing. As the fifth round approached, the Martinez family huddled briefly. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, looked at his mother. "You okay?" She nodded. "I am proud," she said. None of them knew that in just minutes, that pride would be tested in a way none of them expected. None of them knew that a single word, spoken carelessly, fueled by something far older than a game, would try to reduce their entire story to a stereotype. And none of them knew that their dignity, in the face of that moment, would become far more powerful than any $20,000 prize. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with broad shoulders and a thick neck, did not wake up that morning planning to humiliate himself on national television. In his mind, he was just a man trying to win a game. But frustration has a way of attaching itself to the wrong moments. Brad grew up in a small Pennsylvania town that used to revolve around one factory. The plant had been there for generations. His father worked there. His uncles worked there. When Brad was a kid, Friday nights meant high school football and conversations about overtime pay. Then, the factory closed. Brad was in his early 20s when it happened. He remembered the day his father came home with a cardboard box. No speech, no drama, just silence. The town changed after that. Storefronts emptied, neighbors moved away, conversations shifted from pride to blame. Some blamed politicians, some blamed corporations, some blamed the system. And over time, in certain corners of that town, the blame narrowed further. Radio shows talked about jobs going overseas, about immigration, about America not being what it used to be. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, listened, not because he was hateful, because he was scared. He started a small construction company in his 30s. For a while, business was steady. Home additions, roofing contracts, renovations. But in the past 2 years, things had tightened. Rising material costs, bigger regional companies underbidding him, one major contract lost to a competitor who, according to rumors in town, hired immigrant crews willing to work longer hours. Whether that rumor was accurate didn't matter. It fit the narrative Brad had been hearing for years. By the time he stepped onto the Family Feud stage, Brad carried more than competitive energy. He carried resentment. Not loud, not obvious, just simmering. At first, he was polite. He shook Carlos Martinez's hand, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short, black, classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, firmly, maybe a little too firmly. He smiled for the cameras. Jennifer Anderson, a white woman in her mid-40s with a slightly slim build, dark blonde shoulder-length straight hair, pale blue eyes, and an anxious expression, squeezed his arm before the show began. "Let's just have fun," she whispered. Brad nodded. But fun wasn't what he felt as the rounds progressed. When the Martinez family answered quickly, confidently, and correctly, something tightened in his chest. He noticed the audience cheering a little louder for them. Or maybe it only felt that way. When Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother, spoke in Spanish and the board lit up with the number one answer, the crowd's applause filled the studio. Brad clapped, but his clap was stiff. Ashley Anderson, a 25-year-old white woman, tall and slender, long, light brown hair with a center part and large eyes, leaned toward him between rounds. "Dad, relax. It's just a game." He forced a laugh. "Yeah, I know." But inside, the scoreboard was doing something else. It wasn't just numbers, it was comparison. He saw a family celebrating their heritage openly, confidently. He saw pride. And somewhere deep in his thoughts, twisted by years of half-digested commentary and personal setbacks, a question formed. Why do they get to celebrate while I feel like I'm falling behind? It wasn't rational. It wasn't fair. But resentment rarely is. By the fourth round, the Martinez family had a commanding lead. Brad Anderson's answers, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes, became sharper, shorter, less playful. The production crew noticed. One camera operator later said you could see it in his eyes, not anger exactly, but agitation. When STE, a male host in his early 60s, called Brad and Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, up for the fifth round face-off. Brad rolled his shoulders as if preparing for a fight instead of a game. The question appeared, name something people do to celebrate their heritage. Carlos hit the buzzer first. Cook traditional food. Of course. The audience loved it. The board confirmed it. Number 1. Cheers exploded. Brad felt heat crawl up his neck. He turned to walk back to his podium, clapping once, twice, forced, mechanical. And in that half second between pride and loss, between ego and insecurity, between years of internal narrative and the reality in front of him, he muttered it. A word he had heard on talk radio, a word he had heard muttered in hardware stores, a word he had never said on camera before. He didn't shout it, he didn't plan it, but it came out easily, too easily, and the microphone caught every syllable. The moment the director yelled, "Cut!" Brad Anderson's stomach dropped. He knew, not because someone told him, because he saw Jennifer Anderson's face, horrified. He saw Ashley Anderson staring at him, eyes wide. He saw Mike Anderson lean in and whisper sharply, "What were you thinking?" Brad's first instinct wasn't shame, it was defense. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered. But even as he said it, he heard how hollow it sounded. People don't accidentally use words they've never believed. In the sudden stillness of the paused studio, Brad felt something unfamiliar creeping in, not yet remorse, but exposure. For years, his frustration had lived in private conversations, in radio echoes, in nods across bar counters. Now it was amplified. Now it was undeniable. He looked across the stage and saw Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, standing close to his family. Protective. Silent. He saw Abuela Elena's confused expression, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother. And for the first time, a crack appeared in Brad's certainty, not enough to undo what he had said, but enough to feel the weight of it. Behind the scenes, producers debated damage control. On stage, the families waited. And in that waiting, Brad Anderson faced a truth he had avoided for years. Frustration can explain anger, but it does not excuse cruelty. And soon, under the glare of lights and cameras, he would be asked to answer not for a wrong guess, but for a word that revealed far more than he intended. The word itself wasn't loud. That's what made it worse. It slipped out in the space between applause and movement, a muttered fragment of bitterness that should have stayed buried in someone's private thoughts. But microphones are merciless. They don't care about intention. They don't care about regret. They simply capture truth. As Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, turned back toward his family, smiling at the number 1 answer flashing on the board. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, walked past his podium and let the word fall from his mouth. One word, ugly, dismissive, loaded with generations of prejudice. In the control room, the sound engineer froze. "Did you catch that?" The audio replay came through the speakers again, clear, unmistakable. The director's voice cut through the intercom. "Cut! Cut the tape!" Out in the studio, the audience clapped awkwardly, confused by the sudden halt. The lights remained bright, but the energy shifted instantly. What had been playful competition moments earlier now felt heavy. On stage, Carlos sensed something had changed. He hadn't heard the word clearly, but he heard enough. He turned slightly. His smile faded. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, with slightly lighter brown skin, dark shoulder-length, loose, wavy hair, and warm brown eyes, felt it too. She moved instinctively closer to Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver-white hair in a neat low bun, placing a protective arm around her mother's shoulders. "Elena," she whispered softly in Spanish. "It's okay." But she wasn't sure if it was. Abuela Elena looked around, confused by the tension. She had lived through political unrest. She had stood in lines for food rations decades earlier. She knew the feeling of a room turning cold. She didn't need full English fluency to recognize hostility. Across the stage, Ashley Anderson, a 25-year-old white woman, tall and slender, long, light brown hair with a center part, and large eyes, stared at her father. "Dad," she whispered, barely audible. Jennifer Anderson's face, a white woman in her mid-40s with a slightly slim build, dark blonde shoulder-length straight hair, pale blue eyes, and an anxious expression, had gone pale. Mike Anderson, a white man in his early 40s, shorter than Brad, with a stocky build, short dark brown hair, and light brown eyes, leaned close to Brad and hissed, "What were you thinking?" Brad Anderson's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He hadn't meant for it to be heard. He hadn't meant for it to matter. In his mind, it had been nothing more than a frustrated murmur. But in reality, it was something else entirely. Behind the scenes, STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, stood in the control room with headphones pressed over his ears. The audio replayed. He listened once. Then again. No ambiguity. No editing trick. No misunderstanding. The words sat there in the air, undeniable. One of the producers spoke first. "We can edit it out. Resume taping. The audience didn't fully hear it." Another added, "If this airs, sponsors are going to ask questions." A network executive folded his arms. This could become a headline. STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, didn't respond immediately. He removed the headphones slowly. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. He had been in television long enough to understand the calculus. Protect the brand, avoid controversy, minimize exposure. That's how crises usually worked. But this didn't feel like a public relations issue. It felt personal. He thought about his own upbringing in Cleveland, about moments when someone had underestimated him, about the quiet sting of disrespect delivered casually, as if it were harmless. He thought about Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver-white hair in a neat, low bun, standing on that stage in her embroidered blouse, proud, hopeful, and he knew something with clarity. If he stayed silent, the silence would speak louder than the slur. He looked at the director. "No," he said calmly, "we're not sweeping this under the rug." Back on stage, the families waited in suspended uncertainty. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, not just anger, but something older. A protective instinct. He wanted to confront Brad, to demand an explanation, but he also knew cameras were everywhere. This wasn't just a personal moment. It was public. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s with slightly lighter brown skin, dark, shoulder-length loose wavy hair, and warm brown eyes, squeezed his hand. "Stay calm," she whispered. Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver white hair in a neat low bun, watched her grandson's face carefully. She saw the tension in his jaw. She had seen that expression before, when immigration paperwork had been delayed years ago, when a bank loan officer had questioned their collateral. She reached for his hand. "Con dignidad," she said softly, "with dignity." Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, stood frozen at his podium. His mind raced for excuses. "It's just an expression. I didn't mean it like that. People are too sensitive." Each justification felt thinner than the last. The studio audience murmured quietly. A few people near the front had heard the word clearly. One woman shook her head in disbelief. A man whispered to his wife, "Did he really just say that?" The tension was no longer hidden, it was palpable. 10 minutes passed. Then the studio doors opened. STE, a male host in his early 60s, walked back onto the stage. But he did not walk out the way he usually did, with a grin and a joke. He walked out measured, steady. The cameras rolled again. STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed, thick mustache, took his position center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice lower than usual, "something happened here today that cannot be ignored." The room fell completely silent. During that last round, a member of the Anderson family used a racial slur directed at the Martinez family. It was picked up clearly by the microphone. A wave of gasps rippled through the audience. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, tightened her grip on Carlos Martinez's arm, a 52-year-old Latino man. Brad Anderson's shoulders, a 48-year-old white man, stiffened. STE turned toward the Martinez family first. "Carlos, Rosa, I am deeply sorry that this happened in this space." His words were not dramatic. They were deliberate. "You came here to celebrate your family, to celebrate your heritage, and instead, you were disrespected." Carlos nodded slowly, emotion restrained behind composure. Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother, stood tall despite the tears in her eyes. Then STE turned toward Brad. "Brad, do you know what you said?" Brad swallowed. "It was just... I didn't mean..." STE raised his hand gently but firmly. "People don't accidentally use words like that." The air felt charged. STE's voice remained controlled. "This is Family Feud. We compete, we laugh, but we do it with respect, always." The word "always" hung heavily in the air, and in that moment, the game show transformed into something else entirely. Not entertainment, accountability. The room did not breathe. You could feel it. Studio audiences are rarely quiet. There is always movement, a cough, a shuffle, a nervous laugh. But in that moment, it was as if 200 people forgot how. STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, with a sharp yet warm gaze, stood at center stage, hands folded lightly in front of him, eyes steady. He had delivered thousands of punchlines in that studio. This was not one of them. He turned fully toward Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes, with a tense stare. "Brad," he said evenly, "I'm going to give you a chance to speak. But understand something first. This isn't about losing a round. This isn't about competition. This is about respect." Brad shifted his weight. The confidence he walked in with that morning was gone. "I was just frustrated," Brad said. "It slipped out. I didn't mean it in a bad way." There it was, the defense. Not an apology, an explanation. STE nodded slowly, but there was no agreement in his expression. "Let me tell you something," he replied. "Frustration doesn't invent words. It reveals them." A murmur rolled softly through the audience. Brad opened his mouth again, but STE continued, not louder, just firmer. "You didn't just say a word. You aimed it. And you aimed it at a family standing here celebrating who they are." He gestured gently toward the Martinez family. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, stood upright, jaw tight but controlled. Rosa Martinez's arm, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, remained around Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother who watched STE with tearful eyes but quiet strength. STE's tone shifted slightly, less confrontation, more clarity. "This show has been on the air for decades. Families come here to laugh, to compete, to create memories. We do not and will not allow hatred to live on this stage." He paused. That pause mattered. Behind the cameras, producers held their breath. They understood the weight of what was unfolding. Sponsors might call, headlines would form, social media would ignite. But right now, the only thing that mattered was the room. STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, turned back to Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare. "You said it didn't mean anything, but I need you to understand something very clearly. Words like that carry history, pain, generations of being told you don't belong. Brad's shoulders began to sag. For the first time, the defensive posture cracked. He looked toward Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, briefly, then away. STE softened slightly, but only slightly. "I'm not here to destroy you," he said, "but I am here to draw a line." That line felt visible in the air. You can compete hard, you can be disappointed, you can even be upset. But the moment you attack someone's identity, their race, their heritage, you forfeit more than a round. The silence deepened. STE took a slow breath. "Brad Anderson, your family will not continue in this game." A collective inhale filled the studio. "You are being removed from the show." The words landed without theatrics, just consequence. Jennifer Anderson, a white woman in her mid-40s with an anxious expression, covered her mouth. Ashley Anderson's eyes, a 25-year-old white woman with large eyes, filled instantly. Mike Anderson, a white man in his early 40s, stared at the floor. Brad blinked rapidly as if trying to process what had just happened. "STE, come on," he began. STE raised his hand again, not angrily, but conclusively. "This is not cancellation," he said. "This is accountability." The audience erupted into applause. Not wild cheering, not celebration, support for the line that had been drawn. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, stood motionless for a second longer, then nodded stiffly. His pride fought visibly with something else, something that might have been shame beginning to surface. A production assistant approached quietly to escort the Anderson family off stage. As they walked past, Jennifer Anderson, a white woman in her mid-40s with an anxious expression, whispered sharply under her breath, "I can't believe you did this." Ashley Anderson, a 25-year-old white woman, tall and slender, long light brown hair with a center part, and large eyes, avoided looking at the Martinez family entirely. Brad walked straight ahead, jaw clenched, but his steps were slower now. When the doors closed behind them, the energy in the room shifted again. Not lighter, just different. STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, turned back toward the Martinez family. His voice changed. It was no longer authoritative. It was personal. "Carlos," he said quietly, stepping closer, "I am sorry that happened to you here." Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, swallowed hard. "I appreciate that," he replied, measured and dignified. SDA reached out and shook his hand firmly. Then he faced Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver-white hair in a neat, low bun. He took her hands gently in his own. "Señora," he said in careful Spanish, "usted merece respeto." "You deserve respect." Abuela Elena smiled through tears. "Gracias," she replied softly. "Usted es un buen hombre." "You are a good man." The audience, already standing, applauded again, louder this time. But the applause wasn't for drama, it was for dignity. STE, a male host in his early 60s, turned back to the camera. "The Martinez family has won this game," he announced, "and they will play fast money because that's what they earned." Earned. That word carried weight. Not given, not gifted. Earned. As the crew reset for the final round, something subtle but powerful had shifted. The show had not collapsed. It had clarified itself. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about ideology. It was about boundaries. And every person in that room understood it. When Fast Money began, the Martinez family was still shaken. You could see it in their faces. Their smiles were thinner now, their laughter quieter, but their unity was stronger. Maria Martinez, a 24-year-old Latina woman, whispered encouragement to her father, Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, before he stepped forward. "Just breathe," she said. Carlos answered questions steadily. Diego Martinez, a 23-year-old Latino man, followed, determined. When the final score hit 183 points, just short of perfection, but enough to win $20,000, the celebration felt different from earlier, less flashy, more meaningful. They weren't just celebrating money, they were celebrating the fact that their dignity had not been compromised. As confetti fell lightly from above, STE watched them, and in his mind, he knew something. The easy choice would have been silence. The safe choice would have been editing. But the right choice? The right choice had cost something, and it had been worth it. Because sometimes leadership is not about entertaining a room, it's about protecting it. 3 weeks later, the episode aired. The slur itself was bleeped, but everything else remained. STE's apology, his confrontation, the removal of the Anderson family, the embrace with Abuela Elena. Nothing was softened, nothing was reframed. Within an hour of broadcast, social media ignited. Clips of the moment, especially STE saying, "Frustration doesn't invent words, it reveals them," began circulating online. On one side of the internet, praise flooded in. Finally, someone in media with a backbone. That's how you use a platform. My grandmother cried watching this. Civil rights organizations reposted the clip. Commentators praised the calm authority in STE's tone. Teachers shared it in educator groups as an example of accountability handled without chaos. But that wasn't the whole reaction. America rarely reacts in one direction. By the next morning, conservative talk radio had picked it up. "Overreaction," one host said. "The guy muttered something under his breath. Now his life's ruined." A television panel debated whether removing Brad from the show was cancel culture or consequence. A former contestant from another game show tweeted, "Game shows are supposed to be fun. This is getting political." The comment section beneath every clip became a battlefield. Some defended Brad. He just said what he was thinking. People are too sensitive. Others pushed back fiercely. If that word doesn't bother you, ask yourself why. The Martinez family, Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, Maria Martinez, a 24-year-old Latina woman, Diego Martinez, a 23-year-old Latino man, and Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother, watched it unfold from their living room in Phoenix. Carlos sat with his phone in his hand, reading message after message. Some were beautiful. Veterans thanking him for his composure, parents of immigrant children expressing gratitude, restaurant customers promising to stop by. But mixed among them were darker notes, anonymous accounts telling them to go back, emails questioning whether they were playing the victim. Rosa turned off her notifications after the third hateful message. "I don't want Abuela seeing this," she said quietly. Abuela Elena, however, had her own perspective. "I have heard worse in my life," she said softly, "but I have never seen someone defend us like that." At the Martinez Grill locations, something shifted. Customers came in not just for food, but to shake Carlos's hand. One elderly man, a retired firefighter, stood at the counter and said, "My grandparents came from Italy." What that man said, that's not what this country is about. Carlos thanked him, but he also felt something heavier. He hadn't asked to become a symbol. He just wanted to win a game show. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, tall and heavily built, with dark brown crew-cut hair and light blue or gray eyes with a tense stare, faced a different kind of spotlight. At first, he told himself it would pass. "Internet outrage burns fast," he muttered to Mike Anderson, a white man in his early 40s, shorter than Brad with a stocky build, short dark brown hair, and light brown eyes. But it didn't burn out quickly. One of his largest commercial clients called within 48 hours. "We're going in a different direction," the representative said politely. No direct mention of the show, no accusation, just distance. Another contract was paused. Jennifer Anderson, a white woman in her mid-40s, with a slightly slim build, dark blonde shoulder-length straight hair, pale blue eyes, and an anxious expression, stopped attending her usual church small group for a few weeks. Ashley Anderson, a 25-year-old white woman, tall and slender, long light brown hair with a center part and large eyes, deleted her social media accounts temporarily. At home, the silence was different than the one in the studio. it was colder. Ashley finally confronted him one evening in the kitchen. "Do you even realize what you said?" Brad bristled. "I told you I didn't mean it like that." "Then what did you mean?" she asked. He didn't have an answer. The clip replayed constantly on television panels. Each time, Brad saw himself walking off stage. He saw his own face, tight, defensive. He saw STE, a male host in his early 60s, standing firm. And slowly, uncomfortably, the narrative he had told himself for years began to crack. His frustration had always felt justified, but justification didn't erase harm. A month after the episode aired, Brad's insurance provider raised concerns about reputational risk. His accountant warned him business projections were down nearly 30%. Friends in town avoided the topic, or worse, joked about it. One evening, alone in his office, Brad watched the clip again. Not the confrontation, the moment before, the second where the word left his mouth. He froze the frame. There was no anger in his eyes, just habit. That realization unsettled him more than any public backlash. Because habits are built. And if they're built, they can be unlearned, but only if someone is willing to admit they exist. Back in Atlanta, STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed, thick mustache, gave interviews sparingly. When asked whether he regretted how strongly he handled it, he didn't hesitate. "If I can't protect people on my own stage," he said calmly, "then what am I doing there?" He rejected the cancel culture framing. This wasn't about destroying a man's life. It was about drawing a boundary. You cross it, there are consequences. The network quietly implemented new training modules for contestants and crew, clearer language about hate speech, de-escalation protocols. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was intentional. The episode continued circulating online. In some classrooms, teachers used it as a discussion point. "What would you have done?" one civics teacher asked her students. The answers varied. Some said they would have stayed quiet. Some said they would have walked off. Some said they would have confronted it exactly the same way. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't just expose one person. They reveal everyone's threshold. 6 months later, the headlines had faded. The debate panels had moved on. But the consequences hadn't. Not for the Martinez family. Not for Brad Anderson. And not for the quiet understanding that something had shifted, however slightly, in how public disrespect would be handled on a family stage. The story didn't end with applause. It moved into something more complicated, reflection. And in one unexpected phone call, that reflection would lead to a meeting no one saw coming. 6 months is enough time for headlines to fade. It is not always enough time for reflection. By September 2024, the clip from Family Feud was no longer trending. It had been replaced by new scandals, new debates, new viral moments. But for two families, it had never really gone away. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short, black, classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, received the message through an intermediary, a mutual business contact who knew both men distantly. "Brad Anderson wants to meet," the message read. "Privately, no press, no cameras." Carlos stared at his phone for a long time. He didn't answer immediately. That night at dinner, he brought it up. Rosa Martinez, a Latina woman in her late 40s, early 50s, stopped mid-bite. "For what?" she asked quietly. "To apologize," Carlos said. Maria Martinez, a 22, 24-year-old Latina woman, leaned back in her chair, skeptical. "Public apology?" "No, private." Diego Martinez, a 21, 23-year-old Latino man, frowned. He already said enough publicly. Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver-white hair in a neat low bun sitting at the head of the table, listened carefully. Her hands, thinner now but steady, rested on the tablecloth. After a moment, she spoke. "If a man wants to admit he was wrong," she said slowly in Spanish, "that is not weakness. That is the beginning of something." Carlos nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "I don't need closure," he admitted. "I just don't want to carry anger." 2 days later, he agreed to meet. They chose a quiet restaurant halfway between Phoenix and a nearby suburb, neutral ground. Not one of Carlos's locations. Not somewhere Brad would feel cornered. When Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, walked in, he looked different, not dramatically, but smaller. He had lost weight. His shoulders curved inward slightly, as if the confidence he once wore had been replaced by something heavier. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, was already seated. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. No cameras, no applause, no audience to validate either side, just two men. Brad spoke first. "Thank you for coming." Carlos nodded once. "You asked." They ordered coffee. Neither touched it. For several seconds, Brad stared at the table before finally speaking. "I've replayed that day in my head 1,000 times," he said. "I keep thinking about that second, the one before I said it." Carlos said nothing. Brad continued. "I told myself for years that I wasn't racist, that I was just frustrated, that I was just saying what everyone else was thinking." He swallowed. "But when I watched the clip, I saw my daughter's face. I saw my wife's face. And I realized something." He looked up, meeting Carlos's eyes directly for the first time. "I didn't just embarrass myself. I revealed who I'd been becoming." Carlos leaned back slightly. "And who was that?" he asked evenly. Brad exhaled. "A man who blamed the wrong people." The words hung in the air. He went on. "When my contract started drying up, I blamed immigrants. When my town changed, I blamed immigrants. It was easier than admitting I needed to adapt. Easier than admitting I was scared." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive me." Carlos appreciated that. "What are you asking?" he asked calmly. Brad hesitated. "I'm asking you to know I'm trying to change." He explained that he had enrolled in a diversity and bias workshop required by a local business association. At first, he attended reluctantly, defensive, arms crossed. But something unexpected happened. He listened. He heard stories from veterans, teachers, small business owners, people who didn't look like him but had experienced prejudice in different ways. "It didn't feel like politics," Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, said quietly. "It felt like reality." He rubbed his hands together nervously. "I can't undo what I said. I can't undo the damage to your family, but I can stop pretending it was harmless." Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, solid build, short black classic taper hair, square face, and dark brown eyes, studied him carefully. He was looking for deflection, for blame shifting, for excuses. He didn't hear them. Finally, Carlos spoke. "When you said that word," he began slowly, "it wasn't new to us." Brad winced slightly. "My daughter heard it when she was 8, Carlos continued. "My son considered changing his name because of things like that. My mother heard worse in her life." He leaned forward slightly. "But what hurt wasn't just the word." Brad waited. "It was that it came so easily." The honesty landed hard. Carlos continued. "Hatred is learned, which means it can be unlearned, but only if someone is willing to examine where it came from." Brad nodded. "I am." There was no dramatic handshake, no cinematic reconciliation, just quiet acknowledgement. Carlos finally said, "I won't say it's okay, because it wasn't." "I know," Brad replied. "But I will say this," Carlos added. "If you're serious about changing, then teach your children differently than you were taught." Brad's eyes filled briefly, not with theatrical tears, but with the kind of emotion that comes when pride gives way to humility. "I will," he said. They stood to leave. For a moment, it looked like they might shake hands. Instead, Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man with warm, light brown skin, simply nodded once more. Brad Anderson, a 48-year-old white man, nodded back. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness in the storybook sense. It was something smaller, more realistic, a beginning. As Brad walked out of the restaurant, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Not relief, responsibility. And Carlos, watching him leave, felt something unexpected as well. Not satisfaction, but lightness. Because sometimes courage isn't just speaking up in a studio. Sometimes it's agreeing to sit across from someone who hurt you and choosing dignity again. 3 years later, people still referenced that episode, not because of the slur, but because of the response. Moments of hate are not rare in history. They happen quietly, loudly, publicly, privately. What makes certain moments endure is not the offense, it is the line that follows it. For the Martinez family, life did not transform overnight into a fairy tale. They still ran their restaurants, they still paid taxes, they still argued about small things at the dinner table. But something subtle had changed. Customers continued to stop by Martinez Grill months after the broadcast, sometimes just to say, "We saw you on TV." Carlos would smile politely. "We were just playing a game," he'd reply. But they knew it had been more than that. Maria Martinez, a 22, 24-year-old Latina woman with light brown skin, slim build, long black hair in a low ponytail, large expressive eyes, and subtle makeup, finished law school the following year. During one of her interviews for a civil rights internship, a senior attorney asked her about the Family Feud incident. "Did that experience influence you?" he asked. Maria paused before answering. "It didn't make me angry," she said carefully. "It made me aware of how quickly silence can become permission." She was offered the position. Later, she would specialize in employment discrimination cases, not because she saw herself as a symbol, but because she understood the quiet damage words can cause. Diego Martinez, a 21, 23-year-old Latino man with medium brown skin, tall and slim, short black fade hair, long face, and brown eyes, now working as a systems engineer, volunteered his weekends teaching coding workshops for first-generation college students. When asked why, he shrugged. "Representation matters," he said simply, "but preparation matters too." Abuela Elena, a 78-year-old Mexican grandmother with warm brown skin, visible wrinkles, and silver-white hair in a neat low bun, turned 81 that year. At her birthday celebration, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she retold the story, not dramatically, but reflectively. "I have heard worse in my lifetime," she said in Spanish, but that was the first time someone in power said, "No more." She didn't dwell on the insult. She remembered the defense, and perhaps that difference defined the entire legacy of the moment. Across the country, STE, a male host in his early 60s with dark brown skin, bald, and a perfectly groomed thick mustache, continued hosting Family Feud with the same humor and warmth viewers expected. But in interviews, when asked about that episode, he always returned to the same idea. "When you have a microphone," he said, "you have a responsibility." He resisted turning the moment into a political slogan. "It wasn't about sides," he explained once. "It was about standards." Behind the scenes, the network implemented clearer language in contestant agreements. Training sessions on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity became standard before tapings. Quiet changes, structural ones, not dramatic headlines, but meaningful guardrails. In Pennsylvania, Brad Anderson's life, a 48-year-old white man, had also changed, though not in ways that made news. Business stabilized eventually, but more slowly than he hoped. Some contracts never returned. More importantly, conversations in his own home shifted. Ashley Anderson, a 25-year-old white woman, once asked him directly, "Do you still think the same way you used to?" Brad took a long time to answer. "No," he said honestly, and that's uncomfortable. He didn't become an activist. He didn't go on a speaking tour. But he stopped blaming others for his setbacks. He started mentoring younger contractors in his town, emphasizing adaptation over resentment. It was not redemption in the cinematic sense. It was growth in the ordinary one. And sometimes that matters more. The episode continued to surface occasionally, in classrooms, in diversity workshops, in leadership seminars. In one high school civics class, a teacher paused the clip just after STE said, "Frustration doesn't invent words, it reveals them." She turned to her students. "What would you have done?" The answers varied. "I would have stayed quiet," one student admitted. "I would have confronted him," another said. A third raised her hand slowly. "I hope I would have done what STE did," she said. "But I don't know." That uncertainty was honest. Because courage is rarely convenient. It is rarely risk-free. It is often lonely in the moment before applause. What made that Tuesday in March 2024 significant was not that racism existed. That was never in question. It was that silence did not. STE, a male host in his early 60s, could have chosen the easier route. Edit, move on, protect the brand. But instead, he chose clarity over comfort. And clarity has a ripple effect. Not because it solves everything, but because it sets expectation. The world did not transform overnight. Prejudice did not disappear. Debates did not end. But a standard had been publicly reinforced on a stage watched by millions. Respect is not optional. It is required. Carlos Martinez, a 52-year-old Latino man, once reflected in a local interview, "I don't wake up thinking about that day anymore, but I do remember how it felt to have someone stand beside us." That may have been the quiet heart of the story, not punishment, not viral fame, but solidarity. 3 years later, when people referenced the moment, they didn't say, "Remember the slur," they said, "Remember what he did next." And that distinction is everything. Because history does not only record harm, it records response. In a world quick to argue and slow to listen, one game show host made a decision in real time. He did not shout. He did not grandstand. He drew a line. And in doing so, he reminded millions of viewers of something simple, something older than television, older than politics, older than debate. Silence is easy. Courage costs something. But only one of them builds a place where everyone can stand under the lights without fear. And sometimes, all it takes to change the direction of a room or a country is one person deciding that silence is no longer an option. This story isn't really about a game show. It's about what happens when ordinary moments expose extraordinary choices. Most of us will never stand on a stage like STE Harvey's. We won't have millions watching. We won't have network executives waiting for our decision. But we will have moments. Moments in offices, in classrooms, at family gatherings, in group chats. Moments where something is said that shouldn't be. And in those moments, we make a choice. Silence is often easier. It protects comfort. It avoids conflict. It keeps the peace, at least on the surface. But silence can also protect the wrong thing. STE's response worked not because it was loud, but because it was clear. He didn't insult. He didn't humiliate. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. He drew a boundary, and boundaries matter. The Martinez family showed another kind of strength, dignity. They didn't explode. They didn't retaliate. They stood firm in who they were. Even Brad Anderson's story offers a lesson. Consequences are painful, but sometimes they force reflection that comfort never would. The truth is, leadership doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a calm voice saying, "Not here, not today." And that's a standard all of us can carry in whatever space we occupy. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about a moment in your own life, then don't let it stop here. Hit that like button so more people see conversations like this. Share this video with someone who believes respect still matters. And subscribe because we tell stories that don't just entertain, they challenge us. Now I want to ask you something important. If you were in that studio audience that day and you heard that word, would you have spoken up or would you have stayed quiet? Be honest in the comments. Because change doesn't start with television hosts. It starts with us. And sometimes, the difference between silence and courage is just one decision.